The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the empty highway as the four friends drove deeper into the heart of the desert. The desert, vast and endless, stretched out like an uncharted map before them. It had a beauty that was both desolate and breathtaking, and yet they were in no rush to leave behind. They were young, full of hope, and the open road seemed like a promise of freedom, of discovery, of a life just beginning. Their laughter echoed in the car, carefree, the kind of laughter that only the young know how to share. They were four college friends, bound by years of shared experiences, dreams, and a deep, unspoken understanding of one another. The future lay before them, untold and full potential. The trip had started as an adventure, a break from the weight of exams and essays, a celebration of their last year together, a road trip through the American Southwest, a place that seemed as timeless as their friendship. They'd stopped at small towns, visited crumbling ghost towns, marveled at the ancient landscapes that seemed to whisper secrets of a world long gone. Each stop, each town was a small chapter in a story they were writing together, stories of places they would never forget and faces they would never see again. The kind of trip that only youth can afford when time feels like an endless stretch of golden hours. They had found a modest, faded motel nestled in the shadow of the mountains, a place that seemed to exist outside of time, as though it had been forgotten by the world. The paint on the sign was peeling, and the lot was empty except for a few rusted cars that seemed as if they, too, had been left behind. But they were tired, so tired, and the motel had the kind of quiet that promised sleep would come easy. The kind of quiet that made the world feel still and safe, a brief respite from the journey ahead. Their names that had once echoed in the halls of their college campus, filled with potential and promise, were now fading into something else, something darker. It's strange to think of how quickly life can shift from the mundane to the unimaginable. Just days before, they had sat in their dorm rooms, arguing over silly things, making plans for the future, joking about their futures in the real world. But now, none of that seemed to matter. Now, the world had shifted into something strange and unsettling. The road had led them here, to a place they should never have stopped. They had checked into the motel just after sundown. The woman at the front desk had given them a look, a strange, vacant look, as if she had seen too much of the world and wanted nothing more than to be left alone with her thoughts. But she handed over the keys with a smile that was too polite to be real. Maybe she had seen something in them that reminded her of the other lost souls who passed through that desolate place. Or maybe in her eyes, they were just another set of faces passing through her life, never to be seen again. The room was small, the bed made with military precision, and the air smelled faintly of dust and stale cigarette smoke. The sound of the air conditioner hummed softly in the corner, but the room felt still, as though the outside world had never touched it. They set down their bags and stretched out, sinking into the quiet. They made themselves comfortable, cracking open a couple of beers from the cooler they had brought with them, and began to talk about everything and nothing. The kind of talk that comes easy when you're surrounded by good friends. Stories from college, memories of their childhoods, plans for the future. They laughed together as they always did, their voices filling the room like a warm, comforting blanket. But as the night drew on, there was something about the motel that began to feel wrong. It was the kind of wrongness that you can't quite explain, the kind that lingers in the back of your mind like a faint whisper you can't quite hear. At first, it was subtle, a flicker of the lights, a creak in the floorboards, the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway outside. Nothing overt, nothing you could put your finger on, but enough to make you glance around the room every once in a while, wondering if you were imagining things. They brushed it off, of course. It was just the old building settling, the strange acoustics of the desert air. But the unease settled in, a quiet discomfort that none of them could quite shake off. It wasn't until they had all gone to bed that the real strange things began. One by one, they fell asleep, the weight of the day finally catching up with them. But sleep didn't come easy, not in that place. The dreams were strange, full of dark shapes and shifting shadows, and when they woke, they couldn't remember the details, only the lingering sense that something had been chasing them through the night, something they couldn't escape, no matter how fast they ran. The room felt colder now, the air thick with the scent of dust, and something else, something older, The desert wind howled outside, a constant reminder how small they were in the face of all that emptiness. The morning came slowly, as mornings do when you are somewhere unfamiliar, somewhere you shouldn't be. The light crept into the room through the thin curtains, casting long, soft shadows across the floor. It was the kind of morning where you don't want to wake up, where you want to stay wrapped in the warmth of the blankets and pretend that the world outside doesn't exist. But the world was there, knocking at the door, and it wouldn't let them stay hidden forever. They woke to silence, a silence that felt wrong. The air felt heavy, as though the world itself was holding its breath. When they went to check out, they found the front desk empty. No one was there. The keys were left on the counter, as if no one had bothered to check them out. No one had even bothered to lock the door. It was a strange thing to think about. The motel had been so quiet the night before, but now it felt empty in a way that was different, more than just a lack of people. It was as if the place itself had vanished into thin air, leaving nothing behind but the dust and the shadows. They waited for the woman to return, but she never did, and when they finally left, driving away into the horizon, it felt like something had been left behind, something that none of them could name. The authorities would later tell them that the four friends simply disappeared, that they checked out a motel and were never seen again. But those who knew the friends knew better. They knew there was more to the story. They knew that the motel was not just some forgotten relic of the past. They knew that something had happened there, something that had never been fully understood. The police would search, but they would find nothing. No footprints in the sand, no signs of struggle, no evidence that the four friends had ever even existed, except for the empty motel room, the abandoned car, and the ledger entry. It's been decades since they vanished. The world has moved on, and the memory of the four college friends has faded into the distant corners of history. But the motel still stands, its walls weathered by time, and the desert wind still whispers through the cracks in the wood. And somewhere in the back of an old filing cabinet, there's a ledger entry that should not exist. An entry that will tell a story the world was never meant to hear. A story of four young lives lost to the desert, to the shadows, and to something darker than anyone could have imagined. This is where the story begins, not with the disappearance, but with the question: what happened that night? What truth lies buried in the silence of the desert, in the pages of an old ledger? The answers are out there, hidden somewhere in the vast expanse of the desert, waiting to be found. And maybe, just maybe, they'll never be found at all. The morning after the four friends had checked into the desert motel, there was an eerie stillness to the air. It wasn't the usual desert quiet, where the world holds its breath in the heat of the midday sun, nor the peace of a place untouched by the chaos of modern life. No, this stillness was different. It was as though something was waiting for the right moment to reveal itself, and maybe it was already too late for any of them to escape it. The world outside, bathed in the soft light of dawn, seemed both alien and familiar, as though they had wandered into a landscape that no longer belonged to this world. For the four friends, the first few hours of the day unfolded like any other road trip morning. They stretched, yawned, and grumbled about the coldness of the room and the stiffness of their bodies from the long drive. But there was something in the way they moved, something in the eyes of each of them, that suggested they were already feeling the weight of the place they had found themselves in. The room felt oppressive now, the air thick and almost too heavy to breathe. Even the sounds of their voices seemed muffled, as if the walls themselves were absorbing the noise and turning it into something else, something darker, something that could never be erased. The sun had barely risen when they packed up their belongings, the last remnants of their road trip dreams still fresh in their minds. The small town, which had seemed quaint and charming the night before, now seemed distant and forgotten. Its dusty roads lined with old buildings that whispered of past lives, of travelers who had come and gone, never to be remembered. The motel stood there, a dilapidated relic of the past, with peeling paint and faded neon signs. It felt like it had been abandoned for years, like it was no longer part of the world they knew, and yet it was still there, unyielding, unchanging. They moved in silence, each of them already feeling the pull of something they couldn't explain. They knew they had to leave this place behind, but none of them spoke of it. Instead, they walked to the small, windowless office where they had checked in the night before. The woman who had given them the keys, a figure in her mid-50s with tired eyes and a face weathered by years of living in isolation, was nowhere to be seen. The office door was open, but it felt empty, as if the world had already moved on without them. The keys, now left on the counter like a forgotten artifact, felt like a cruel reminder of what had been. They waited for a while, their hands hovering over the counter, unsure of what to do next. The silence stretched longer than they expected, and then they noticed something strange. The ledger. It was open to a page they hadn't seen before, a page that seemed to have been left behind, as if someone had been interrupted in the middle of writing something. There were names there, written hastily in a neat, looping script. The names were unfamiliar, and yet they lingered in the air, refusing to be forgotten. Their presence was unsettling, like something was trying to speak to them through time, through the very ink on the page. A strange feeling settled over them as they picked up their keys and walked out of the office. It was subtle at first, the sense of being watched, of something tracking their every movement. They stepped into the parking lot, their eyes scanning the empty horizon, but there was nothing to see except the dust, the sky, and the endless stretch of road that led nowhere. There was no one around, no sounds except for the distant cry of a lone bird, and yet they all felt it, the undeniable sensation that they were not alone. The world around them was silent, but there was a hum, a faint vibration beneath the stillness. The motel itself seemed to be holding its breath, as though it, too, was waiting for something to happen. They piled into the car, the engine sputtering to life, and for a brief moment, it felt like they had escaped. They were driving away, leaving the motel and the haunting silence behind them. But even as the miles ticked by, as the landscape unfolded around them, there was an unspoken tension in the air, a heavy weight pressing down on their chests. No one spoke of it, but all of them felt it. The feeling that they had left something behind, something important, something that wasn't supposed to be forgotten. The further they drove, the more this feeling grew. It was as though the desert itself was drawing them in, wrapping them in its vast, unforgiving embrace. They couldn't shake the feeling that the place they had just left behind wasn't finished with them yet. The miles stretched on and the car hummed steadily beneath them, but the road ahead seemed to grow darker, more uncertain, as if the desert were a labyrinth with no way out. They began to speak again, their conversation light at first, the kind of talk you have when you're trying to ignore the heaviness in the air. They joked about the strange woman at the front desk, about the odd feel of the motel, about how it looked like something out of an old horror movie. But as the words left their mouths, they all realized how little they believed in their own attempts at humor. There was something real about the motel, something wrong. They didn't know what it was, but it gnawed at them, a small splinter of unease embedded under their skin. As the day wore on, the landscape outside the car window began to change. The flat stretches of desert gave way to jagged cliffs and towering rocks, their jagged peaks cutting through the sky like the bones of the earth. The air grew hotter, the sun more unforgiving. It was a kind of heat that burned your skin and left a dry taste in your mouth, a heat that made everything feel distant, like the world was fading into the distance, becoming a mirage. And still, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the heat or the oppressive silence of the desert. It was something deeper, something more primal. It was a sense that they were being followed, watched, as if the land itself had eyes. They tried to rationalize it, but the more they thought about it, the more their minds twisted in knots. The strange name in the ledger, the absence of the motel's owner, the way the place seemed to hang in the air like a forgotten memory, it was all too much. By the time they reached the next town, the sense of unease had settled into the pit of their stomachs. They checked into another motel, one that was less eerie, less empty, but the feeling lingered, hanging over them like a cloud, as if the desert had marked them, chosen them to carry its weight. That night, they tried to sleep, but the dreams were restless. They could see shadows in the corners of their vision, fleeting glimpses of something moving just out of reach. The air felt thick and suffocating, pressing down on them as they lay in their beds, unable to escape the weight of it all. The following day was no better. They drove in silence, their faces drawn, their eyes tired. It was as though the desert had already taken a part of them, and they hadn't even realized it until it was too late. The further they drove, the more distant their old selves seemed, as if they had become strangers to one another. The warmth of their friendship, once so effortless, now felt like a memory slipping away, fading just like the landscape outside their windows. As they passed through small towns and roadside attractions, they all knew, deep down, that the adventure they had set out on had changed. Something had shifted, something that could never be undone. The motel, the strange name in the ledger, the haunting silence, they couldn't escape it. And as they made their way back toward civilization, toward the places they knew, the realization began to set in. The desert had not let them go. It had taken something from them, something they would never recover. They would never speak of it again, not directly. But they all knew the truth. That night in the motel had changed them. It had left a mark, an invisible scar that would never heal. The truth was buried beneath the endless sand, hidden in the pages of a ledger that should never have existed, and it would never be found. Because some things are meant to be left buried in the desert, far away from the world that demands answers. Some stories are never meant to be told. The disappearance of the 4 college friends did not go unnoticed. For days, their families and friends combed the area, desperately searching for any sign, any clue that might explain where they had gone. The small town where Motel was located seemed like a place where nothing ever happened, a place so quiet that even the wind felt hesitant to disturb the dust on the roads. But now, in the wake of the vanishing, everything about it felt different, haunted. The residents who had gone about their daily lives with little more than an occasional nod to each other now found themselves looking over their shoulders. The town, so used to the stillness of life, had been thrust into clamor of an unsolved mystery. The friends' families arrived one by one, the pain and confusion already written across their faces. They had been notified about the disappearances only hours after it had happened. At first, the authorities thought it might just be a case of the group deciding to go off the grid for a while. After all, young people often do that, don't they? They decide they don't want to be found. But as the hours stretched into days, the assumption of a voluntary absence began to wear thin. This wasn't like any disappearance they had ever encountered. This wasn't a spontaneous trip, an impulsive escape. There was no message, no signs of rebellion, no indications of a breakdown or a dispute. It was as if they had simply walked into the desert and vanished into thin air. The first search was frantic. Volunteers from the small town, alongside the families, started scouring the area around the motel. They checked the desolate highway that stretched for miles in both directions, looking for any sign of a car, any clue that could suggest the friends had driven away. They examined the surrounding desert, combing through the sand dunes and scrub brush, hoping to find footprints, a tire track, anything. But the land gave up nothing. It was vast, relentless, and indifferent. Even the simplest of clues seemed to slip through their fingers like the sand they had sifted through in a futile attempt to find something solid, something real. The police investigation took on a similar tone. Local law enforcement, though determined, quickly found themselves out of their depth. The motel, with its quiet exterior, offered few answers. There was nothing out of the ordinary in the records, no signs of struggle, no indication of foul play. The staff at the motel, the same tired woman who had given the keys, and the strange manager who never seemed to stay in one place long enough to talk to anyone, were just as unhelpful. It was as if they had disappeared into the air, leaving no trace behind. The motel itself seemed to hold no secrets. There were no alarms, no signs of forced entry. No one had even heard a scream. The only thing they had were the questions, the endless, gnawing questions that refused to be answered. Days turned into weeks, and the search slowly turned into something else. A cold case. The town small, local police force did what they could, but they had no real leads to follow. They talked to motel employees again, but the answers they gave were vague at best, and the details seemed to fade away as quickly as they were spoken. It was clear to the families that the case wasn't going to be solved here, in this small, forgotten corner of the world. But what they didn't know was that their search would not end so easily. The feeling that something had been overlooked, that the answers were closer than anyone realized, hung heavy in the air, as thick as the desert heat. And then, as if the universe itself had decided it was time to shine a light on the dark corners of the mystery, something unexpected happened. A breakthrough, if you could call it that, came not from the hands of law enforcement, but from most unlikely of sources, an old historian from a nearby town. He was a man who had made it his life's work to preserve the stories of the forgotten, the lost, the overlooked. He had spent decades combing through archives, old newspapers, and faded documents, looking for stories that had been lost time. When he heard about the disappearance, something about the case caught his attention. There was something about the location, about the town, about the motel. He didn't know what it was, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something waiting to be uncovered. The historian began his own quiet investigation, starting with the old motel ledger. It was a thick, worn book with leather bindings, yellowed pages filled with names and dates of guests who had passed through the motel over the years. Most of them were transient visitors, people passing through on their way to somewhere else. But as he flipped through the pages, he noticed something strange, something that had been overlooked by others. A name. It was listed on the same page as the 4 missing friends, but it didn't belong to any of them. It wasn't even the name of a guest who had been registered to stay at the motel. It was an entry that didn't make sense, written in neat cursive with a date that coincided with the night the friends had disappeared. And the name? It was one that seemed completely out of place, a name that no one had ever heard of before. It wasn't just strange, it was chilling. The historian's curiosity grew as he dug deeper. The name had no obvious connection to any local residents, no ties to the town or the nearby areas. It was as if this person had arrived from nowhere and just as quickly vanished. And then, as if guided by some invisible force, the historian began to connect dots. He found references to the same name in a series of old town records, linked to an individual who had been involved in some very questionable activities. Unsettlingly, this person had been connected to secretive operations, some of which hinted at things that had no business being connected to a sleepy desert town. There were vague mentions of unusual dealings in the desert, military contracts, hidden experiments, covert government projects, and always the name that didn't belong. There was no hard evidence linking this individual to the disappearance of the 4 friends, but the coincidence was too strange to ignore. As the historian followed the breadcrumbs, he uncovered an even darker possibility. The name had appeared in a series of similar disappearances over the years. It wasn't just a single case of missing person. It was part of a pattern, one that stretched back decades. Each disappearance had occurred near isolated motels, quiet rest stops, places that seemed to exist outside the normal flow of time. And the name, always the same name, appeared at each one. The connection was tenuous at best, but it was there, woven through the fabric of the town's history, like a secret that no one was meant to remember. The historian's findings were shocking, but they didn't provide answers, at least not the kind that anyone could easily accept. What had happened to the 4 friends? And why were they connected to this strange figure? Was it just a coincidence, or was something far darker at play? Could it be that the 4 friends hadn't simply disappeared, that they had been taken, chosen for some reason they would never understand? The answers to these questions lay beyond the historian's reach, but one thing was certain. The mystery was deeper than anyone could have imagined. As the days wore on, the families of missing friends were left with no more than what they had started with: unanswered questions, an unbearable weight of uncertainty, and a nagging feeling that they were missing something. The authorities had grown tired of searching, and the families, though still desperate for answers, knew that time was working against them. They began to turn to other avenues, to try and piece together a narrative from the fragments of what they knew. But the more they tried, the more elusive the truth became. The desert, with its vast emptiness, had swallowed the friends whole. The answers they sought seemed just out of reach, taunting them, making them question whether they would ever find the truth. And so, the mystery lingered. The missing friends, who had once been full of life and promise, became nothing more than another tragedy to be whispered about in dark corners, a name that would soon be forgotten by everyone except those who had loved them. The desert had taken them, and it wasn't in any hurry to let them go. The motel, like so many others in the forgotten corners of the American Southwest, seemed almost to be built for obscurity. From the outside, it was just another crumbling building tucked away along a long stretch of highway, a relic from a bygone era, when the open road was an invitation, not a threat. The faded neon sign that once glowed brightly at night now flickered weakly, casting an eerie light on the cracked pavement below. The walls, peeling and stained by time, were slowly being swallowed by the desert, nature's quiet, persistent erosion of all things man-made. The interior, though, seemed to tell a different story. It was a place frozen in time, where the air was thick with the residue of years of neglect. Dust settled in every corner, undisturbed by the hands of those who had come and gone. Yet, there was something about this particular motel that seemed to draw attention, something about its history that couldn't be easily ignored. Most motels, with their faded upholstery and chip paint, would be forgotten in time, swallowed by the relentless march of progress. But this one had a way of lingering in the background, like a shadow that refused to be outrun. There was a peculiar stillness in the air when you entered, as though the place itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen, or perhaps waiting for someone to remember what had already been forgotten. The missing friends case, with its unanswered questions and unanswered pleas, was just another tragic story in the long list of tragedies that unfolded at this very motel. But as investigators began to dig deeper into its past, they found that the motel's history was anything but ordinary. It wasn't just a motel that had fallen into disrepair. It was the people who had passed through it, the strange collection of transient visitors whose paths seemed to cross at this one isolated point in the middle of nowhere. What initially appeared to be a rundown, insignificant building turned out to be a place where stories were left behind, a place where the stories of missing people and unexplainable disappearances had become too numerous to ignore. It was as though the motel itself had become a black hole, a vortex that absorbed all the inexplicable and unresolved mysteries of surrounding desert. And like any place that harbors dark secrets, it was the people who had lived in and around the motel who held the most unsettling truths. The employees, few and far between, seemed to know more than they let on, their faces often betraying a weariness that suggested they had seen more than their fair share of strange happenings. The woman who had checked the four friends into their room, her face a mask of indifference, had worked at the motel for as long as anyone could remember. She had seen countless travelers pass through the door, all of them leaving with their own stories, their own reasons for coming and going. But she had never seen anyone like the four friends. The strange energy that surrounded them seemed to linger long after they had checked out, hanging in the corners of the room like an invisible presence. She would later say, when pressed, that there was something about them that had seemed different, not in an obvious way, but in the way they carried themselves, as though they were not entirely present in the world around them. And that feeling, that nagging suspicion, stayed with her long after they had disappeared. Then there was the manager, who was never around when anyone needed him. His shifts were erratic, and his comings and goings were always shrouded in mystery. The few people who had seen him in passing described him as a man who never seemed to stay in one place for too long, always moving, always looking over his shoulder, as if he were hiding from something, or perhaps someone. He was the kind of person who could slip into the background, unnoticed, even in the most mundane of situations. But those who had tried to press him for more information about the missing friends quickly realized that he knew more than he let on. He was never forthcoming, never eager to engage in conversation about the missing group. And whenever the topic came up, he would quickly change the subject, offering vague explanations or simply walking away. As the investigation into the disappearances continued, the authorities began to uncover troubling patterns that linked the motel to a darker, more sinister history. The records revealed a string of similar cases, all centered around this one isolated location. It wasn't just the four friends who had gone missing. The motel had been the site of other strange disappearances over the years, some of them going back decades. The names, the dates, the circumstances, they were all too similar to be mere coincidence. There was something about this place, something that seemed to draw people in, only to swallow them whole, leaving nothing behind but the haunting memories of their brief stay. Some of the stories spoke of travelers who had come to the motel looking for rest, only to vanish without a trace. Others mentioned strange figures, people who checked in but never left. There were whispers of late-night knocks on the door, of shadowy figures seen in the hallways, of unsettling sounds that echoed to the empty rooms. The more the investigators dug, the more they began to suspect that the motel was not just a place where people went missing. It was a place where people were drawn, as if by some invisible force, to a fate that they could not escape. But the most chilling discovery was the realization that the motel itself had been involved in something much darker than anyone had initially imagined. It wasn't just a stopover for travelers on their way to somewhere else. It was a hub, a nexus for activities that were far beyond the scope of what anyone could have guessed. The The connections began to surface, one by one. Local criminal networks, covert operations, rumors of secret military experiments carried out in the desolate wilderness surrounding the town. The more they uncovered, the more it became clear that the motel had been a key player in a much larger, more dangerous game. The trail led to figures who were well known in the shadows, men and women whose names were whispered in hushed tones, people whose actions were never fully understood, whose motives remained mystery. They were part of a network that operated beneath the surface, hidden from the public eye, and the more the investigators dug, the more they realized that the missing friends, along with others who had vanished over the years, were not random victims. They were pieces in a much larger puzzle, one that had been carefully constructed and meticulously maintained. The motel, it seemed, was not just a place for rest. It was a location for something far more insidious. The families of the missing friends, devastated by the lack of answers, began to piece together the stories of others who had disappeared in similar circumstances. They started to realize that the connections between the people who had vanished were not coincidental. Some of the missing individuals had been linked to high-profile disappearances from the past, while others had simply dropped off the map, leaving no trace behind. But the common denominator, the thing that tied them all together, was the motel. It was always the same. Always the last stop before they disappeared, swallowed up by the desert and the shadows that seemed to haunt this forsaken place. But it wasn't just the disappearances that troubled those who investigated the motel's history. It was a sense that the place itself was something more than just a physical structure. The air in the rooms, thick with dust and the smell of old cigarettes, carried a weight that could not be ignored. There was something wrong with the motel, something that went beyond the decay of age. It was as though the walls themselves held the stories of the lost, their memories preserved in the very fabric of the building. It was as though the motel had become a witness to things that no one should ever see, a place where reality bent and twisted into something unrecognizable. And so, as the investigation unfolded, the motel, with its crumbling exterior and decaying walls, began to take on a life of its own. It was no longer just a building. It was a symbol of everything that had gone wrong in the desert, a monument to the people who had disappeared and to the forces that had drawn them into its grasp. And as the investigation continued, one thing became painfully clear. The answers were not going to be easy to find. The truth was buried deep within the motel's walls, hidden behind layers of dust and secrecy, waiting for someone brave enough to unearth it. But whether the truth would ever come to light, whether the people responsible for the disappearances would ever be brought to justice, remained uncertain. The motel, it seemed, was a place where the past and present collided, where the stories of the lost were written into the very foundation of the building. It was a place that had witnessed so many disappearances, so many lives interrupted, that it had become something else entirely. A place of darkness, a place where the rules of the world no longer applied. And for those who were brave or foolish enough to seek answers, it was a place that offered only more questions. The days following the disappearance of the four friends were filled with a strange combination of hope and dread. As the authorities continued to search the barren landscape surrounding the motel, something began to change in the way the investigation was unfolding. For those who had followed the case from the very beginning, it was becoming increasingly clear that something far more disturbing was at play, something that no one, not even the most seasoned investigators, had fully grasped yet. The deeper the police dug, the more unsettling the details became, until they were left with a series of unsettling questions that refused to be answered. It was a discovery of a small, seemingly insignificant detail in the police files that would set the entire investigation on a new trajectory. A local resident had come forward, claiming to have seen the four friends of mourning after they had checked out a motel. The witness, a retired truck driver who had passed through the area on his way to a nearby town, reported seeing a car matching the description of the missing group's vehicle parked near a remote stretch of desert road. But when he approached to offer assistance, the car was empty, completely abandoned. There were no footprints around the vehicle, no sign of a struggle, and no indication that anyone had been near it recently. It was as if the car had been left there, quietly waiting, forgotten by its passengers. The witness's statement sent shockwaves through the investigation. If the four friends had truly left the motel and driven out into the desert, then where had they gone? And why would they leave their vehicle behind, especially in a place so desolate and isolated? It didn't make sense. Every instinct told the investigators that the story didn't add up. It was as though the friends had been there one moment, and the next, they had simply vanished, leaving behind only their vehicle as the sole trace of their existence. At first, the authorities dismissed the truck driver's claim as nothing more than an unreliable sighting. After all, the desert was vast, and anyone passing through the area might have mistaken one car for another. But as time passed and the search for the missing group yielded no results, the truck driver's story began to resonate with those who were still looking for answers. The absence of any traces of the friends in the immediate vicinity, coupled with the mysterious circumstances surrounding their disappearance, began to suggest that the case was far more complex than anyone had imagined. It wasn't long before the investigation turned toward the possibility that the friends hadn't just disappeared. They had been taken. The desert, with its harsh, unforgiving terrain, became more than just a backdrop to their story. It became a vast, empty void, a place where the rules of the world no longer applied. And somewhere, hidden within that emptiness, there was something far more sinister at work. As the weeks passed, the case began to unravel in ways no one had expected. Investigators who had originally thought the disappearance was a simple case of young people fleeing the constraints of their everyday lives began to wonder if something much darker had drawn the group into the desert. They pored over every detail of the motel's history, looking for any link that might explain why the four friends had been drawn to this isolated place at all. What had they stumbled upon during their stay? Was it merely the motel itself, with its dilapidated exterior and strange energy? Or was there something more, something hidden beneath the surface, that lured them in? It was during one of these late-night investigations that an unexpected breakthrough occurred. The authorities had been combing through old records related to Motel, hoping to find something, anything, that could explain the disappearances. They were already familiar with the strange ledger entry that had been discovered, the one that had been written on the same page as the four friends' names. But as they dug further, they uncovered something even more bizarre. Several other names, all linked to strange, unsolved disappearances, were written on the same pages. It was as if someone had been keeping track of the guests who had stayed at the motel over the years, making a note of who had checked in and, more importantly, who had never checked out. It became clear that the missing friends were not the first to vanish at the motel. There were other names in the ledger, scattered across decades, all connected by one thing: the motel itself. In fact, it seemed as though the group of missing friends had been part of a much larger pattern, one that stretched far beyond just a small, forgotten motel. It was a pattern of people disappearing without a trace, with no logical explanation for their sudden vanishing. And the motel, with its faded walls and peeling paint, seemed to be the common thread that tied it all together. The more the investigators learned, the more they began to question everything they had believed about the case. The friends, who had seemed so ordinary, so full of life, were now part of a far larger and more sinister mystery. It was as if the very fabric of reality was being bent in strange and unsettling ways, pulling the four of them into something much darker than they had ever anticipated. They had been pulled into a world where the line between the living and the dead was thin, where the boundaries of time and space had begun to blur. The history of the motel, as it turned out, was not just a series of random, disconnected events. It was a story that spanned decades, a story that had been quietly hidden in plain sight. There had been whispers for years about the motel's connection to the government and military experiments in the area, but nothing had ever been confirmed. Now, with the case of missing friends, those whispers began to take on a darker, more disturbing tone. Some speculated that the motel had been used as a cover for covert operations, a place where people could disappear without raising suspicion. Others believed that the motel itself was somehow tied to the land, an ancient, cursed place where strange forces could take hold of those who were unfortunate enough to stay there. The deeper the investigation went, the more strange coincidences emerged. There were reports of unusual electrical disturbances around the motel, incidents where the power would flicker or go out entirely, even when there was no storm or reason for it. Guests had spoken of strange dreams, of feeling watched, of hearing footsteps late at night when no one was there. And then there was the story of the man who had checked into the motel years before, a man who had come to the area on business but had never left. He had been seen in the motel, walking down the hallway late at night, his face pale and hollow, his eyes glazed over as if he had been lost to some terrible force. His name had been written in the ledger too, but when investigators tried to track him down, they discovered that there was no record of him ever existing. The authorities were now convinced that the case was not just about 4 missing students. It was about something much larger, something that had been hidden beneath the surface for years. They began to reach out to other law enforcement agencies, hoping to find someone who might have encountered something similar, someone who could shed light on the growing mystery. But even as they widened the investigation, it became clear that they were in over their heads. No one had any answers, and the closer they came to the truth, the more they realized that some things were better left unknown. The families of the missing friends, meanwhile, struggled to hold on to any shred of hope. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months. Each new lead, each new discovery, only seemed to raise more questions, more doubts. It was as though they were all part of a never-ending cycle, a story that refused to have an ending. Their grief was compounded by the feeling that they were chasing shadows, that the answers they so desperately sought were just out of reach. The more they learned about the motel and its strange, haunted history, the more it became clear that the missing friends were not the only ones that had been affected by it. They had simply been the latest chapter in a much larger story, one that had been unfolding for decades, one that seemed to stretch back to the very beginning of the motel's existence. The motel, with its worn-out exterior and its faded charm, had become a place where reality itself had started to unravel, where the very laws of nature no longer applied. But no matter how many names were uncovered, no matter how many pieces of the puzzle were put into place, there was still no sign of the 4 friends. They had vanished, swallowed up by the desert, by the motel, and by something far more mysterious than anyone could have imagined. And the investigation, for all its progress, had reached a dead end. There was no way forward, no way back. Only the lingering question, where had they gone, and why? As the investigation wound down, the families were left with a haunting feeling that they might never have the answers they so desperately sought. The case had become a riddle without an answer, a story with no closure. The motel, with its crumbling walls and dark secrets, remained an enigma, a place where the past and present collided in ways no one could understand. And in the end, that was the most unsettling part of it all. The truth, whatever it was hidden somewhere in the desert, buried beneath layers of time, waiting to be uncovered, but perhaps never meant to be found. The truth, when it came, didn't arrive in the form of a grand revelation or a climactic event. There was no sudden breakthrough, no moment of clarity that tied all the disparate threads of the case together. Instead, it unfolded slowly like a haze that began to lift with each new discovery, each new piece of the puzzle, until the picture became undeniable, yet still elusive. The more the investigation progressed, the clearer it became that the missing friends had been part of something much larger, something deeply unsettling and far more complex than anyone could have imagined. It wasn't just the strange circumstances of their disappearance that gave the case its eerie undertone. It was a sense that something had been deliberately hidden, something that had been covered up for years. There was a deliberate obscurity about the entire situation, a veil of silence that hung heavily over the motel and its history. It wasn't that the authorities had missed something, they hadn't. It was that they had never been meant to find it. The layers of secrecy surrounding the motel were far deeper than anyone could have anticipated, and the truth, as they would come to learn, was something that could not be easily revealed. As investigators continued to comb through the sparse records and faded documents tied to motel's past, they began to uncover a pattern, one that had been buried beneath decades of dust and neglect. It was as if the motel itself had become a repository for lost souls, people who had disappeared without explanation, whose names had faded into obscurity, their stories never to be told. There were no signs of foul play in any of the cases, no physical evidence, no obvious connections between the victims, but the names scattered throughout the ledger seemed to have been written in a language of their own, a language that said more than it appeared to on the surface. They weren't just random entries. They were part of something far larger, far more sinister than anyone could understand. The deeper the investigation went, the more unsettling it became. It was clear that these names, these lost individuals, were not just travelers passing through. They were linked to a much darker web of influence, to forces that operated beneath the surface, unseen but deeply felt. The authorities began to reach out to other investigators, hoping to find someone who could make sense of the strange occurrences at the motel. But what they found was only more uncertainty, more unanswered questions. Each new person they spoke to seemed to know less than the last, as if the very nature of the case was so dangerous, so forbidden, that no one dared speak of it in full. And in some cases, they simply couldn't. The connections, as tenuous as they were, began to suggest that the motel wasn't just a site of disappearances. It was a focal point, a crossroads of something far more dangerous. Then, in a small, dusty town a few hundred miles away, another thread of the story began to unravel. A man, once a key figure in local government, came forward with information that he had kept hidden for decades. He had been part of a project, an experiment, to be exact, that had taken place in the desert during the 1960s, shortly before the motel had been built. The man, older now and worn by the years, had remained silent for most of his life, but the recent string of disappearances had stirred something in him, something he had long buried deep within his mind. He spoke of government tests, of experiments that pushed the boundaries of science and morality. He spoke of a hidden agenda, one that had been carried out in the shadows, far away from the eyes of the public. And, he said, the motel had been involved in it. According to this man, the desert was more than just a barren wasteland. It was a testing ground. The government had established a covert facility in the area, one that operated in complete secrecy, under the guise of a research center. It wasn't just a scientific outpost. It was a place where dangerous and unethical experiments were conducted. The goal, he said, was to manipulate human perception, to control the mind, to create a perfect subject. The project was known by a different name, but the details were classified. The motel, he explained, had been built not just to house travelers, but to serve as a front for the operations that took place in the area. It was a perfect cover, a quiet, unassuming place where people could disappear without anyone asking questions. The man went on to explain that the motel was involved in what he referred to as observation protocols. The idea was simple: to place ordinary people in a setting where their behavior could be monitored and manipulated, all in the name of research. The guests who stayed at the motel were unknowingly part of a grand experiment, one that involved subtle mind control techniques. The researchers, the man revealed, had used a variety of methods to influence their subjects: psychological manipulation, sensory deprivation, and even hypnosis. The goal was to create a controlled environment where the subjects would be unaware of the influence they were under, unable to resist whatever was being imposed upon them. But this man was not just talking about the government's involvement in the motel. He was talking about the broader project, an experiment that had grown far more dangerous over time. According to him, the motel had become the site of numerous disappearances, many of them going back decades. The missing people were not simply victims of chance. They had been part of a much larger scheme. The government's interest in the motel had shifted from observation to something far more sinister: the creation of subjects who could be controlled and manipulated to carry out covert missions without their knowledge. It was a program designed to remove free will, to create a perfect agent, one who could carry out any order without hesitation. The more the authorities learned from this man, the more they began to realize that the four missing friends were not just victims of a random act of fate. They had been targeted. They had been chosen for a reason, and their disappearance was part of something much larger than a simple case of missing persons. It was a realization that sent chills down the spines of everyone involved in the investigation. The idea that they had been walking around with such a dangerous and twisted secret for so long was almost too much to comprehend. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, the investigators started to understand the true scale of what had happened. The four friends had stumbled onto something they were never meant to see. They had checked into a motel that was built on lies, designed to deceive, to mislead. They had unknowingly entered into a world of shadows, a world where the line between reality and manipulation had been blurred beyond recognition. And once they had been inside, once they had checked in and signed their names in a ledger, they had become part of something much bigger, something that had been in motion for years. But what happened to them exactly? Had they been taken, just as the others had before them? Were they being held somewhere, hidden away from the world, their minds being manipulated for some unknown purpose? The more the investigation unfolded, the more the answers remained elusive. It wasn't that the authorities didn't have the pieces of the puzzle. They did. It was that the pieces didn't fit together in a way that made sense. The truth was far too disturbing to grasp fully, too complicated to untangle. All they could do was chase after shadows, unable to catch up, unable to understand the depths of what had been done. The families of the missing friends, for their part, remained hopeful, though their hope was beginning to fray. They had always believed that their loved ones would be found, that someone would eventually uncover the truth. But as the investigation progressed, they began to realize that the answers they were looking for might never come. The friends, they feared, might never be seen again, not in the way they remembered them. The people they had once known might have been altered, their memories erased, their identities forever changed. They might have been reduced to mere pawns in a game far beyond their understanding, their fate sealed by forces they could never comprehend. It was a chilling thought, that the friends had not simply disappeared into thin air, but had been taken as part of something much larger, something that had been orchestrated long before they had ever set foot in the motel. The truth, when it finally came, was not one they could have ever anticipated. The friends, like so many before them, had been part of an experiment that had been hidden in plain sight, a project that had sought to control the very essence of human will. The investigation, though still ongoing, had already revealed that the four missing friends were more than just victims. They were symbols, representatives of a far-reaching conspiracy, one that stretched across time and space. And though their names would be forgotten by most, they had become an indelible part of the story, an unsolved mystery, a riddle that would never be answered fully, because some truths, as it turned out, are too dark, too dangerous to ever be fully uncovered. As the months passed and the investigation grew colder, the families of the four missing friends struggled to find a way to hold on to their grief. The pain of not knowing, of having so many questions but no answers, wore them down. The families clung to the fragments of hope that had once seemed so abundant. They held on to the memory of their loved ones, the voices that still echoed in their minds, the faces they could no longer see but could still picture so vividly. But every new development, every new piece of evidence uncovered, seemed to push them further into an abyss of uncertainty. It was during these dark months, when it seemed like the search for the truth was grinding to a halt, that something changed. An unexpected source came forward, a witness, someone who had been hiding in the shadow for years, unsure whether their voice would be heard, afraid that speaking out might bring them into something they were not prepared for. The witness was a former motel guest, someone who had stayed at the same motel decades earlier in the 1950s. The person was now much older, but the memories were still sharp, vivid, and unsettling. They had checked into the motel long before it had gained its infamous reputation, long before the stories of missing people became part of the town's whispered legends. At first, the authorities were skeptical. They had heard countless stories over the years, rumors of strange occurrences, of unexplainable disappearances, but nothing that could be verified. This new witness, however, wasn't just someone passing through, someone with vague recollections. This was a person who had been in the motel, who had witnessed things firsthand, things that seemed out of place, things that defied all logic and reason. The witness described staying in one of the rooms closest to the back of the property, a room that overlooked the abandoned desert landscape. They recalled strange noises at night, muffled sounds that seemed to come from the walls themselves, from deep within the building. It was a sound like whispering, like a voice struggling to break free from some invisible barrier. It was a constant presence, as if the building itself was alive with secrets. The witness spoke of the strange atmosphere that permeated the motel, a feeling that lingered in the air, thick and oppressive. Even during the day, there was something unsettling about the place, a heaviness, a sense that something wasn't quite right. But it was at night, the witness said, that things truly became disturbing. They described hearing footsteps in the halls when no one was supposed to be there, seeing shadows dart across the walls, flickering in the dim light from the hallway. And then there were the people, guests who had checked in but seemed to vanish without a trace. This witness claimed to have met one such person, a man who had come to the motel with mysterious air about him, someone who didn't quite fit. He had checked in, had stayed for a few days, and then on the fourth night, he was gone. No one ever saw him leave, and there was no trace left behind. The witness didn't think much of it at the time, attributing it to a strange coincidence. But in retrospect, They couldn't shake the feeling that something far more sinister had been at play. The most unsettling part of the witness's story, however, came when they revealed that they had seen something that had haunted them for decades. On the night the strange man disappeared, the witness had woken up to a sudden, sharp noise in the hallway. They had gotten out of bed and peered through the small gap in the door, trying to understand what had disturbed their sleep. Through the crack, they saw something that no one would have believed had they not been there to witness it. A figure, tall and shrouded in darkness, moving quickly down the hall. It wasn't a human figure. It was more like a shadow, a silhouette that didn't quite belong. The figure was carrying something, or someone. It was hard to say. The witness had only caught a brief glimpse before the figure disappeared into the shadows, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. At first, the witness had thought it was just a bad dream, a product of their imagination. But over time, they began to realize that they weren't the only one who had experienced strange things at the motel. The more they spoke with others who had stayed there, the more they heard similar stories. Stories of people disappearing, of unsettling experiences that seemed too strange to be mere coincidence. The witness, now an older man, had never spoken of these events to anyone until now. He had kept his silence for decades, afraid of what his knowledge might bring, unsure if anyone would believe him. But now, after so many years, he knew it was time to share what he had seen, what he had lived through, in the hope that someone might finally understand what had really been happening at that motel. As investigators began to piece together the witness's account with the other evidence they had uncovered, a terrifying pattern began to emerge. The disappearing guests, the shadowy figures, the whispers in the walls, all of it pointed to something far more insidious than anyone had imagined. It wasn't just a case of people vanishing. There was a darker force at work, something that seemed to prey on those who entered the motel's doors. This was no longer just about the 4 missing friends. The motel had been a site of unexplained events for decades, and the truth, as horrifying as it was beginning to take shape. The investigators turned their attention back to the records, digging deeper into the history of the motel. They found more names, more guests who had checked in and never checked out. Some had been reported missing. Others had simply disappeared from the ledger, their names erased without explanation. It was as though the motel itself had become a vessel for something dark, something that fed on the lives of those who stayed there. The more they dug, the more they realized that the story of the missing friends was just one chapter in a much larger, much darker narrative. But even as the investigation grew more intense, the families of the missing friends found themselves caught between a sense of dread and a desperate need for closure. The authorities had promised that they would get to the bottom of the case, that they would uncover the truth. But as the months stretched into years, hope began to fade. The families were left with only the fragments of memories, of photographs, of moments they would never get back. The loss was too great, too overwhelming to bear. And yet, there was still a small part of them that refused to give up, that still clung to the hope that their loved ones might be found, that they might somehow return. But as the investigation pushed further into the unknown, even they began to question if the people they had once known were still the same. What had happened to them? Were they still out there, somewhere, trapped in a world that no one could understand? Or had they become something else entirely, lost, twisted, altered beyond recognition? As the years went by, the investigation began to stall. The strange occurrences of the motel, the growing number of missing persons, and the whispers of covert government projects all seemed to point to the same conclusion. The truth was too dangerous to uncover. No one knew who or what was truly behind the disappearances. The shadowy figures, the whispers, the manipulation, they were all part of a much larger conspiracy, one that no one was truly prepared to expose. And so, the investigation slowed to a crawl. The families left with their unanswered questions, their lives forever marked by the mystery that had taken away their loved ones. The motel, with its crumbling exterior and faded memories, stood as a silent witness to everything that had transpired. It had become a symbol of the darkness that lurked in the desert, a place where time seemed to stand still, where the past and present collided in ways that no one could comprehend. The names of the missing friends, once so full of life, were now lost in the sands of time, their fates sealed by a force that had yet to be fully understood. But in the quiet, in the stillness of the desert, the story was far from over. The truth, whatever it was lingered in the air, waiting to be uncovered, waiting to be understood. The families, haunted by the unanswered questions, began to slowly move on with their lives. But there was no escaping the shadow of the motel, no escaping the unanswered mystery that had come to define them. The town, once so quiet and so easy to forget, had become a place where the past would never be forgotten, where the echoes of those who had disappeared would forever haunt the landscape. And for those who had known the missing friends, the mystery would remain, a riddle with no solution, a story without an end. But the desert, it seemed, had claimed its secrets, and it wasn't in any hurry to let them go. As the investigation into the four missing friends continued to stagnate, an unsettling truth began to emerge, one that threatened to upend everything the authorities thought they knew. It became clear that the disappearance of friends was not just part of an isolated pattern. It was part of a much larger, darker tapestry that had been weaving itself over decades, and the threads connecting the case to others were becoming more and more apparent. The deeper the investigators dug, the more they realized that the case had grown far beyond the confines of a simple missing persons report. There were connections, yes, but they were not connections anyone could have anticipated. Despite the years that had passed since the disappearance, the small town surrounding the motel still whispered of the strange occurrences, the eerie happenings that had long been dismissed as mere coincidence. But now, with the mounting evidence, the whispers were beginning to sound less like idle gossip and more like desperate cries for acknowledgement. The motel, which had once been a simple stop on a long road trip, had become something far more sinister, a nexus for a series of events that, when pieced together, painted a chilling picture. The authorities had originally assumed the friends had vanished because of some mistake, some lapse in judgment. Maybe they had gotten lost in the desert, or maybe they had simply been victims of an unfortunate accident. But the more they spoke with locals, the more the missing persons case began to resemble something far more orchestrated. It was as though the desert, the very landscape surrounding the motel, had become a silent accomplice, hiding secrets that had remained untouched for years. The question that lingered in the minds of those still working on the case was no longer just about where the missing friends had gone. It was about what happened to them, who or what was behind their disappearance. And what was the hidden force that seemed to pull people into the orb of the motel, trapping them in its grasp like moths to a flame? The families of the missing friends were desperate for answers, but with every lead they followed, the trail only grew colder. Each discovery only seemed to deepen the mystery, leading them to more questions than they had started with. One breakthrough came when investigators unearthed an old photograph, buried deep in the archives of the town's history. It was a black and white picture taken decades ago, showing a group of individuals gathered outside the very same motel. There were no names listed on the back, no identifying information, just the image of a group of strangers, all standing with the same strange look in their eyes, an expression of quiet unease, as though they were aware of something hidden just out of sight. But it wasn't just the people in the photo that caught the attention of the investigators. It was the location. The motel was the same, but there was something different about the landscape in the background. It was clear that the photo had been taken at a time when the area surrounding the motel was far more developed, far more populated. The people in the photograph seemed out of place, standing there as if they had no reason to be there, no connection to the land around them. It was a feeling of displacement, a feeling that would later be echoed by every person who came into contact with the motel. They were all outsiders in a place that wasn't meant for them. The unsettling nature of the photograph only deepened as the investigation continued. The more the authorities uncovered about the history of the motel, the more they began to suspect that the location itself was more than just a rundown building in the middle of nowhere. There was something about the land, about the way it had been settled, that suggested a darker history. Local records were sparse, almost intentionally so, as if someone had deliberately erased traces of the past. But a few scattered details began to emerge. Details about a group of early settlers in the area, a group of individuals who had arrived at the land long before the motel was built. According to old town rumors, these settlers had been involved in strange rituals, in practices that bordered on the occult. The more the investigators delved into these rumors, the more they began to wonder whether the land itself had been cursed, whether the motel was merely a conduit for something that had been unleashed long ago.